Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepytime Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Do you find you lie there with your mind spinning and churning? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones that you can't solve right now, and will probably be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns, but slowly letting go and drifting into the deep night. Before we go any further, I've got a question aimed, at all listeners, but specifically at people who've been listening along for a while. Do you find Sleepytime Tales helpful to you? Do you have the means to provide me with a little bit of support? If you do, please help me to grow the show by supporting me on Patreon. I want to really grow this show so that I can help more people. So I want to do a little bit of an equipment upgrade, and I also would like to not be out of pocket every month. So if I could get a little bit of support to help me make ends meet, it'll make things much easier for me and more pleasant for listeners if I can upgrade my equipment to improve my sound quality. And it'll help me keep the show coming as frequently as I do. And ultimately, I really would like to do this full-time, a very long-term hope. Not going to happen anytime soon, I know that. But I would like to do this full-time so that I can do more episodes and put a little bit more time into doing some more creative stuff. What I do is helpful, but I feel like I could do more if I had more resources. And so if you sign up on the Patreon, I've got two levels at the moment. Because I live in South Africa, it's not hard to make ends meet here. So I have a $1 level, which I've got to promise you that even if you only have $1 a month that you can spare, it really does help me. And even at $1 a month, you get a sort of material benefit. I do weekly bonus episodes on Radio Public, but I figured that if anyone's willing to give me $1 a month, I'm going to make those available without making you listen to advertising there. So at the $1 level and the $5 levels, you get a thank you, you get a shout out on an episode, and you also get access to the Catnap bonus minisodes, which are released weekly, otherwise only on Radio Public, because they play there with advertising and I get a little kickback. And if you have $5 to spare, and I've got to think there are a few of you out there, you get the Catnap bonus, you get a shout out on the episode, you get listed on the website, same as the $1 level. And they are also do 2 special bonus edits of every main episode. I do one without this whole promotional section in it, and I do one that's only the story. So if you really, really like the stories and really, really don't like the intros, you can make them disappear for $5 a month, and you still get every weekly episode, but just without that stuff. As a bonus to new $5 patrons up until the end of, I think I'm going to run this until the end of November, I'm going to do sort of handwritten postcards and send them out to new $5 patrons, just as a fun sort of thing. It'll come, I don't know how long it takes to get to various countries from where I am, but something will pop up in your mail at some stage, which is a fun thing. And also I'm going to start listing my patrons in the show notes on the episode, so that my current patrons, you're going to see them listed here as well as the website, and I'm going to call them out. And I'm providing, I've come up with a new sort of incentive. If I reach $50 in backing on Patreon by the end of November, I will do a bonus video podcast. The video will be exclusive to all patrons, and I will pull out the audio and release that as a bonus episode, probably in January, to all subscribers. Shout out to my new patron who signed up this week. Was it this week? Yes. Last week, as you listen to it, sorry. Megan Hapgood. from Canada. She signed up at $5. Thank you very much for your support, Megan. Enjoy your bonuses. And then also, if you don't have any money available, but you would still like to contribute a little bit, I've got a couple of options for you as well. I've got the Audible trial that is common to pretty much every new podcast out there. If you go to my link, audibletrial.com/sleepytime, you will get a free audiobook to keep, as well as a 30-day free trial of the Audible service. And I'll get a little bit of a kickback as well, which is a handy amount of money. I would like to thank Emily and Stuart, who have signed up for the Audible trial to give me a little bit of help. And obviously, anyone who signs up, please let me know, because I don't get any kind of notification. And then I'll give you a hello on the episode as well. For the little method of contributing without costing yourself anything is if you listen to the show on the Radio Public app on your Android or Apple device, you get access to the Catnap Weekly bonus minisodes, as well as all regular episodes, and I get a little bit of a kickback from those as well, which is kind of handy. A reminder that the music in this episode and all episodes thus far is Un Désert by Kumiko. Their music is available on the Free Music Archive, and I've linked their website and their Patreon in the show notes, as they've got some very cool stuff which they release under various names that I recommend checking out. So what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales, and what is a sleep aid podcast? To answer your question, let me start with a common problem. Do you find that you lie awake at night with your mind spinning and your emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you find yourself waking up in the middle of the night and you just can't quite go back to sleep even though it's only 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to talk you into a restful night. I'm someone who has struggled to sleep basically my entire life. I wasn't a big sleeper when I was a baby, and I gave my parents many, many restless nights. And even once I got old enough not to bother them anymore, it was always a struggle for me to sleep. It was only around my mid-30s when I discovered the tendency, when I was listening to like video game podcasts in bed at night, that I discovered the tendency for droning male voices to just absolutely knock me out at night. I started listening actually to back episodes of the shows that I liked specifically to help me sleep eventually. And it was actually at the beginning of this year, 2019, when I discovered that there actually are podcasts out there specifically intended to help people sleep. I tried one out that worked really well for me. It was designed specifically to help distract the restless mind, to help keep your attention a little bit focused so that you don't think about all the stresses of your life. While it worked very well for me, whenever I recommended it to other people, it wasn't, a lot of people didn't really enjoy it. Some didn't enjoy the narrator's voice, or they found it distracting. So I thought to myself, I've got this boring, drony voice, so maybe I should actually try use it for a bit of good and see if I can bore people to sleep myself. And I'm here now. You're all listening to my 31st episode, and so far it seems to be going fairly well. I think I may stick with this for a bit. This is a joke, of course. I'm really, really enjoying what I'm doing. I love hearing from people that I've been helping them, and I'm looking forward to launching my second season soon on the 7th of October. So things are going to have a little bit of a change. Yeah, so I hope you enjoy what we're doing here and stick around. Now, every episode starts with this long intro, and now while most of my feedback has been very positive, one not uncommon complaint is that people don't like this really long intro. Unfortunately for them, it's here for a reason, and I have heard back from other people when I've mentioned it that they really appreciate it. So that's why I provide the timestamp, so you can skip it if you don't like it. But the intro is here for two reasons. The first one is for if you're a new listener and you haven't listened to Sleepy Time Tales before. This is the part where I explain to you what the purpose of the show is, or what it's for, and different ways that you can consider engaging with it to help you get yourself a good night's sleep. This point also is now the intro also for longer term listeners, people who've been around for a while. This is a chance for them to sort of start preparing themselves to sleep, because if you haven't been sleeping for a long time, you really need to sort of develop like rituals and habits around it to try get back into the habit of sleeping, or get into the habit of sleeping first time in your life. Because ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a space together, a sort of nest, a mental nest, an emotional nest for you to curl up in. So the two ideas here there are different ways that you can engage with the show. Two that I can sort of think of as more common ways, but if you engage with it in a different way, I'd actually love to hear from you. Drop me an email or hit me up on social media just to tell me if you do something differently, and I'll share it and see if it works for others. So the two things is, when I listen to sleep podcasts, is I put them on a fairly low volume, but I try to listen to them quite closely, because I have a tendency to start stressing out about stuff. I wouldn't say I have an anxiety disorder, but it is something that it does affect me occasionally sometimes. And I get very stressed out. So if I just have something to listen to that I can just sort of keep a light mental grip on, it helps me a lot so that my mind doesn't spin out of control and stress me out. And then eventually, as I'm following along the story, that mental grip kind of lets go and I just drift into sleep. The alternative also is that you just turn the volume down low and let it drone in the background and don't engage with it at all. Sometimes just that little droning noise in the background may be helpful for you. Now, tonight's episode is a bit of an unusual one. I've mentioned that we're heading towards the end of what I'm now thinking of, because I didn't plan it this way, of my first season of the show. Basically, as of October 7th, I'm starting from a relatively clean slate. Things aren't going to change a lot, but the way I structure things and the way I do things is going to be quite different. So it's going to be a little bit of a change up for the listener. Hopefully things actually become a little bit better for you and a little bit more consistent. Obviously, I'm hoping you're asleep by the time the episode ends, but if you're not, I'm hoping the story stays a little bit more engaging. So tonight what I'm doing is I'm actually basically recapping my season 1 of the adventures of Buddy, the young boy who started out with a bear and meeting a bear and met a whole bunch of magical forest creatures. So I'm going to recap most of the story and explain sort of a lot of my sort of processes and stuff. It may be interesting, but honestly I hope not, because at the end of the day this isn't supposed to be all that interesting. But as long as it's enough to keep your mind engaged, just enough to stop you from stressing out and worrying about the sort of anxieties that have us staring at the ceiling at night. But the important thing is, what you do is that you don't force the sleep. Just keep a light mental grip on my voice and on the story, just so that the need for sleep can take over. Now, as I've said, I'm hoping you're asleep before I get to the end of the episode, but it's important that you don't feel pressurized. It may not work on the first night if this is your first night with us. Give it 2 or 3 nights of trying before you give up, because as I said, I must also get out of the habit of saying as I said all the time. We're trying to create new habits for you, habits of sleeping and habits of lying down in the dark and habits of getting your mind on a single track rather than spinning and flying off. But again, don't feel pressurized. It may take a few nights for you. You may need some time to get used to my voice. The whole idea of lying in the dark and listening to some strange dude droning at you may be a little bit odd. It is a little bit odd, but it works for people. It's very important, whatever that you do though, is that you try to relax. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this may take a while for you, even a few days for this to work. So be patient, relax, and take the time to develop new habits. What I do with sleep podcasts is I just actually basically play them all night. I queue up a few and let them go. I used to struggle to go to sleep, but now lately my bigger problem actually is waking up in the middle of the night and not being able to go back to sleep. So I just let my podcasts stream all night. I lie down in the dark with my earbuds and let them run. When I wake up at 3 a.m. and the stream's still running, if my earbuds are popped out, I pop them back in and I let the voices waft me back to sleep. There are even a few rare occasions, and they are really my favorite, is sometimes I wake up about 30 minutes before my alarm goes. Oftentimes, not always, but sometimes I carry on just listening to the podcast and I fall back asleep again. There's something in that final 30 minutes, that extra 30 minutes, that just makes the night so restful. There's something about just allowing yourself to relax completely right before the alarm that is deeply, deeply satisfying. And so you have the basic idea. You relax and you lie in the dark, and while you do that, I tell you a tale. So relax, dear listener, my nighttime friend who has elected to lie in the dark, listening to my voice. You'll always be safe with me, because I'm here to help you to relax, to do my small part to improve your life in a big way. Insomnia is a public health crisis at the moment. There's a lot of people who are not sleeping, and it just makes life harder. So I'm here to do my part to help you, to help others, to help you and them to face tomorrow and the day after, well rested and better able to cope. One thing that's very central to the whole conception of the show is the benefits of kindness. I want to be kind to you. I want to share kindness with you. I need you to be kind to yourself. If you can't fall asleep, don't beat yourself up, or don't rebuke yourself over not being able to get to sleep. Don't lie there tense if you just can't get yourself over the edge of sleep, even with me here in your ears trying to help. Frustration is a great enemy of a good night's sleep. One of the primary intentions of this podcast is to short-circuit that frustration, to distract the feeling that we get when we blame ourselves for not being able to let go and drift into the dark. So take a breath and forgive the fact that you can't sleep, and let my voice wash over you. Take another breath. Imagine the warm darkness rising up, inviting you to sleep and to a better life starting tomorrow. And if you can't let go, forgive yourself and try again tomorrow. If you've had a life of insomnia, sleep is something like an enemy. But it is not your enemy. It's a natural process that we've been pulled away from by stresses of life and the progress that shines bright lights in our eyes at all hours. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. Buddy and His Adventures, a Season 1 recap. So we've reached the temporary end of our adventures with our little friend Buddy. I wasn't really intending to do the show as a season type thing when I started, but I think it's evident as we go through the stories of Buddy that you'll see that things didn't go quite as I planned in a lot of ways. Well, this story more than the other one, the Rivers to the Stars ones, went in very unexpected directions as I was telling it, as my initial conception basically turned out not to be particularly interesting. And I think if I stuck to what I initially planned, I would have lost listeners very quickly. So I'm just going to sort of run through my initial ideas of the story and how it went, and sort of my thinking with it and what that basis is of the stories that I'm coming up with going forward. It sounds very much like something you might help you fall asleep. I don't think it's going to be too interesting to anybody as I sit and gaze in my navel on microphone, but it may still be interesting as a sort of insight into my creative process and how I'm actually, as we're going along, I'm actually only discovering my creative process now. So the initial thing when I was starting this podcast was I didn't really know what I was going to sort of base my weekly episodes on. I've said before that I based it pretty much on the idea of Sleep With Me, which is my absolute favorite sleep podcast, that when I recommended it to other people, they didn't really enjoy it. So in a lot of ways, conceptually, a lot of what I initially came up with is very much Sleep With Me based. Although I think I've developed, I don't have quite the same skills as Dearest Scooter does, and so I think things have developed in a very different direction quite quickly. The buddy stories in particular, one of the things I was planning on doing was looking for fun news stories and using those as story seeds for something more interesting. The buddy story, if you've been around since the beginning, was based on a news story that came around February or March of this year of 2019 about a young toddler, 3-year-old, who disappeared from his house for, I think it was 3 days. And then he was suddenly found in the woods, none the worse for wear, if a little bit dirty and disheveled. And he said he had been hanging out with a bear for the time that he had been missing. So now, obviously, my first episode, Buddy and the Bear, was pretty much based straight up on that, with a little bit of my own twist and coming up with a theory for it, more or less what happened. Except I'm not someone who likes child in peril stuff, so Buddy's parents never even noticed he was missing. He wasn't gone for 3 days. He was gone for a few hours in the company of a bear. The initial idea was that Buddy was going to be wandering around in the woods regularly and meeting up with various animals and having various adventures. After I ran through my cycle of ideas, the start of my second story, the Rivers to the Stars stories, my Twin Peaks episodes that I was doing that I then dropped because I knew going in that Twin Peaks was a fairly dark show. I didn't also realize quite how brutal it was, because I had very vague memories of it from when I was younger, and I was going to use this as an excuse to actually watch it, because I've been having it sitting waiting for my attention for years. But as I worked through the cycle and I came around to writing the next episode, or at least outlining the second episode of the story of little friend Buddy, I realized that I was actually in quite deep trouble. There was no way I was going to be able to stick with my initial concept and make it even vaguely interesting, even though the point of the story is to be boring and help you fall asleep. I think Buddy going around and wandering around in the woods randomly with this animal would be even too much for anybody. It was at this point that I started coming up with this sort of central idea of most of my stories, is that the concept needs to be quite interesting. It needs to sound potentially interesting to you, even if ultimately my rendition of the story is snoozeworthy and has you falling asleep by the end of the episode. And Buddy meeting rabbits and walking through the woods, and Buddy meeting ferrets and walking through the woods, it didn't come across as conceptually interesting. So yeah, that was not gonna work out in any kind of way. So what is an alternative? I've sort of, at this point, I'd kind of I was quite enjoying making the show by then. Didn't want to give up on it, and I needed to come up with an idea fast. So I cast my mind to the sort of things. Actually, when I was quite a bit older, then I haven't been very specific about Buddy's age in this. Obviously, his character was based on the 3-year-olds in real life, but also realized that a 3-year-old would not be the most interesting protagonist quite soon. So I've sort of aged him up a little bit. In my head, he's probably around 6 or 7, but also sometimes he acts a little bit younger, so it's a little bit up in the air exactly of his age. But I remembered something that happened to me when I was quite young, probably around 9 or 10. I lived on a small farm, and I used to go on quite long walks the length of the farm. And at one stage, I got to one place where there was a spring with a few trees around it, and being a young man or a young boy with a wild imagination, I heard drumming noises when I was in this, like, I can't even call it woods. It was like literally like 6 trees, little copse of wattle trees. And I heard these distant drums that in my mind were the fairy drums coming from somewhere. Realistically, it was probably a car driving past or something with music booming. But it was something that hit me quite hard when I was younger, and it's a memory that's stuck with me for a long time since. So I sort of imagined that Buddy had, to me, then it was like, okay, this was a logical direction to go. That Buddy would start having encounters with not just animals and creatures, but actual magical forest spirits and forest creatures, maybe fairies and the like. Now, when I was at that age, I got my hands on the gnome book. There was the TV show David the Gnome, although it was in Afrikaans, so it was called Davy die Kabouter. Being called David myself, was called Davy die Kabouter through much of my primary school. I was a little bit on the short side, or I think gnome size is a little bit overstating it. What was the name of that book? It's actually quite interesting going through some old notes, some old episodes, as well as like I've really sort of refined how I do this. It's a lot easier to find things in the more recent ones. The book Gnomes by Will Hagen and Rien Poortvliet, the Dutch writer and artist, respectively. Their book was fascinating. It was styled like a biology textbook, and for a very young nerdy child with a fascination for the fantastical, the book was incredible. It treated the subject matter like a 19th century biology textbook, something, or 18th century, something you would expect to find written by Charles Darwin, his observations in the forest near his house. I remember actually finding a lot of similar books at the time. There were ones about fairies and ones about trolls and all sorts of other creatures, although I've never actually been able to figure out who or what those ones were. In my memory, they're very similar looking books of a similar sort of style, but I don't think Rien and Poortvliet were involved in those, and I still need to try scratch around and see if I can track those down, because those are also generally fascinating little books. I'm actually just remembering now, my younger sister, there were those part works that you used to get from the newsagents. You'd get like one book, or you'd get a book and the box that they would all go in, and then every 2 weeks you'd go and buy the book. And my sister had a set of those for the gnomes. I'm actually just remembering that right now as I'm talking. It's quite fascinating. I wonder what happened to those books. Really, that's memory's a funny thing. You would think I'd have remembered it when I was telling the story in the first place. But anyways, I was at the age when I was reading these books, they sort of presented themselves as factual. I didn't believe them, obviously. Well, not obviously. I was young and I thought I heard fairies drumming in the woods myself. But I didn't believe that they were true, but I loved the whole idea of them being treated as real. It's something I still love, actually, is works that engage with fiction and treat it as though it's something real, sort of technology of Star Wars or Star Trek. Those sort of things are still very interesting to me, because it's amazing also how much thought fiction creators, especially in things like movies where they have these huge teams, how much they put into things like that, how much thought they put into, if not necessarily realism, a sort of internal consistency. And something you also find often in comics and other sort of nerdy media, the sort of lore and reality that's unique to those stories. So after that, I kind of had a direction to go in. I had my first story. I had Buddy who was going to meet some gnomes, and I wasn't sure initially how to do it. And I sort of, as I was planning the story out, I started putting together in my mind what his house was like and his yard was like, and they had the sort of barn slash, but a barn didn't make sense, but in my head it looked like one, but it wasn't a farm. So this barn, workshop, garage thing with his dad's cars and gnomes that like to nick the tools and borrow them and occasionally return them, but generally speaking would lose them to their neighbors, the goblins. And so that was actually really where the conception of the story of Buddy and his adventures actually began, or where it was reborn basically after my very flawed initial idea. And so Buddy met the gnomes, and he went to the gnomes' home, and he met the king of the gnomes. And he found out that the gnomes occasionally would come into conflict with the goblins that lived even deeper underground than they did. But now, when I introduced things like the goblins, I had an interesting new challenge, because the one thing I promised to myself, and I promised to the listeners from the beginning, was that Buddy would never be in any kind of danger. I don't do I don't do child and danger stuff. I don't watch it. I don't get involved with it. I just hold no truck with that sort of thing. Even before I was a parent, I hated to see children in danger or hurt. So it was a new challenge for me. Like, how could I have these things that are traditionally antagonistic goblins? I mean, I grew up with Tolkien and all sorts of high fantasy and low fantasy, and goblins are always bad news. But the idea that gnomes and goblins conflict, but it was more good-natured rivalry than actual vicious warfare or anything like that, kind of came to me fairly quickly, I think. And the idea that Buddy ultimately would kind of go and make friends with the little goblins, because it was just Buddy's nature to be friendly with everything. And he is going through a world in which there really is no danger to him. Because that's the promise I made to myself and to you, the listener, that Buddy would never be at risk. So that was basically the conception of that. And rather than go with traditional representation, the goblins are tricky things, because every culture has a different thing that they call a goblin, or is translated as a goblin. I mean, even African cultures have things that vaguely translate as a similar concept. Malicious little beings that live under the ground, strangely enough, are common to pretty much every culture. So the idea that gnomes and goblins actually would be almost like cousins is something that occurred to me. The gnomes are shorter, goblins are a little bit taller, but they're more stooped, and they live deeper underground, so they're a little bit more haggard and a little bit paler. But ultimately, they're pretty much the same creature. And of course, Buddy wouldn't make friends with them, and we'd find out that the goblins are very industrious, and they mine, and they work hard, and they do steal the tools from the gnomes, which are usually borrowed from Buddy's family or other neighbors. But the goblins leave the jewels out. The jewels that they mine out to be found and essentially to pay for the stuff that they were stealing. So to me, it's a sort of like almost like barter culture, unwilling barter culture that they, and a game that both the little groups of people take part in without ever making it explicit. But both sides, the gnomes basically did believe that they were being robbed all the time, but they never really got too upset about it because they got piles of gems in return. Because the goblins were just leaving them lying around for them to steal and feel proud of themselves with. And Buddy would spend some time mining and helping work gems and developing his little skills and his clever little fingers. And it's like a fun idea. And obviously at this stage, Buddy is very definitely not 3 or 4 years old. I think it's about this stage that I really start thinking about him as being around 6 or so. Probably not a great time to be handling sharp tools and gem cutting equipment, but I'm sure the goblins were looking after him carefully. And so, like that, basically, I was halfway through my first season. Buddy met the bear, he met the gnomes, and he met the goblins, and those were the sort of centerpiece of his magical adventure that he was on. It was also at this point that I started realizing my love for not realizing my love for it, but sort of, I did realize that my fondness for the TV show Gravity Falls, quite an old cartoon series now that's on Disney that is rather fantastic. Sort of conceptually, this whole idea of a young boy, this one solo, Gravity Falls has 2 children, sort of having wonderful adventures with the local magical wildlife. And then that sort of helped me develop my way through the rest of the season. The next one obviously was when Buddy encountered the pixies while he was out playing with his gnome friends, Freddie and Crystal and Carol. I think those are the names I settled on for the 2 female characters. I think I did go for Cheryl at one stage as well. Carol and Cheryl being something from the TV show Archer. That's adults only. Children don't watch that. There's a character who I've watched many seasons and I actually can't remember what her name is because at one stage they switch interchangeably between Crystal and Carol because it's a running joke. Cheryl and Carol, not Crystal. And I pick names also that will end up confusing me. Now Buddy's having lots of daytime adventures with his gnome friends, and they go and they encounter some pixies, little winged fairies in a tree. And at this stage now also I'm like, okay, I need some kind of stakes and some kind of action to make things interesting for the listener, at least vaguely interesting, to keep you listening long enough to help you fall asleep. And again, I don't want conflict. I don't want to put Buddy at any kind of risk, so rescuing a pixie that was got a little bit rambunctious and fell in the water seemed like a fairly low stakes, still interesting activity for him. So obviously he made friends with the pixies after he rescued one that fell into the water. It was shallow water. Even the pixie was never in any real danger, but it was in an unpleasant situation, and Buddy helped it out. Now, by this point I was starting to get the idea of structuring, of wider structure for the show, for Sleepytime Tales going forward. So I started doing a sort of building towards a finale for the Buddy story. I said finale, I think we're going to come back to him again towards after my second season. I've got 2 totally different other stories planned for now, but we will be returning to Buddy, and I think I'm going to have a slightly stronger conception of him as a character and of the adventures he's going to go on, which I think you listeners are going to enjoy. So the ultimate thing that I definitely wanted to have for Buddy was I wanted him to encounter fairies, but I wanted him to encounter real Anshe type fairies, the sort of ones from Celtic mythology, and that seemed like a good climax for the show. So that was going to be my 6th episode of the story of Buddy, but I used a 5th episode first. And I thought it would be fun to have something actually go slightly wrong without any kind of real stakes. So that was when I hit the idea of the gnomes coming to pick Buddy up to meet the fairies and coming a day early so that they end up encountering a bunch of trolls in the forest instead. That hit me as potentially something quite fun, sort of. And the trolls and the fairies, even I made the sort of celebrations between the two different, but also some points of similarity as a sort of yin and yang contrast. I sound really I sound really a little bit overbearing when I put it like that, don't I? Yin and yang. I'm not 19 anymore, Dave. You can't be saying nonsense like that. But the idea of the conceptions of the fairies and the trolls having sort of at a root similar sort of concepts with very different executions for their celebrations seemed like a fun sort of thing to do. And so that was the main thing. And Buddy went to the woods. He encountered the trolls, and he was very tired afterwards because he had a big celebration. And also I wanted to contrast it with him meeting with the fairies as well. Well, I wanted that to be a big party as well, but the idea of him coming back from both tired and both having to a little bit of recovery time seemed boring, so I wanted to sort of contrast the two. Now, the trolls are magical creatures and the gnomes are magical creatures, but they're not quite to the level of the fairies of the Sidhe. So I wanted very different consequences to both very late night parties. You'll recall the Anshe story, and I pronounce it differently every time. I've looked up pronunciation guides for these Irish words and Irish phrases, and honestly, it's tough because they don't seem to agree with each other. The Anshe would basically return him home as though nothing had ever happened, although he still remembered it. And that also sort of ties in with the mythology of the Sidhe, the Tuatha De Danann, that sort of controlled over people's perceptions and reality of being very strong and very powerful. And basically that's it. That's the adventures of Buddy and his first set of adventures in the woods near his house. Me babbling a little bit about how things didn't go according to plan and how much I've changed conceptions of things going forward. I've essentially got a whole new season very roughly planned out of 2 different fictional stories and mythologies, and I'm going to do movie reviews as a thing every 4th week as well. I'm going to be staying away from TV shows for now. And definitely going to be staying away from extremely violent and disturbing TV shows with subject matter that I don't think I should be sharing when I'm trying to help people to sleep. Especially when I know now that children actually listen to this, and I really would rather stay away from anything that would bug them. And bug me. Like I say, I don't like... There's actually so many TV shows now that I don't even watch, even if I'm entertained by them, because I just don't want to bring myself down. I want my entertainment to be light and fluffy as much as possible these days, which maybe is a comment on me, I guess it could be, but ultimately I don't actually care, because life is hard, and this show is here to help make it a little bit easier, and that includes me doing it for myself. I don't want to do things that disturb my state of mind and my peace of mind. So yeah, that's it. That's me doing what I can to look after you folks. If you're still there, well done. I'm proud. On one level, I'm proud of you for sticking through this really boring ramble of mine. And on another, if you're listening to me, I'm sorry I wasn't quite boring enough, because you should be well asleep by now. Yeah, that's it for tonight. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of the Sleepytime Tales podcast, the podcast designed around a bedtime story that's going to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Un Désert by Kumiko. Check out more of their work on their website and their Patreon, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.